community geographic information system that I started. And what's great about it, it gives students the opportunity to go out in the community and help provide these GIS resources. So Hoffman Triangle, I'll explain a little bit more about that and why we started looking at that particular neighborhood as a pilot within New Orleans to be able to look at whether 15-minute cities really could apply at the neighborhood level. Again, I know we have some people that may not be familiar with 15-minute city. And I'll say up front, the slides will be available afterwards, so you'll be able to see this more closely. There's been some criticism about 15-minute city, that it's not a new concept, but in fact, it builds upon many other planning concepts from Ebenezer Howard and the Garden City in 1890 to the neighborhood concepts. And what this really shows you and develops is we're focused on green belts, greenways, and closer proximity to resources. But think about in the 1890s, we certainly weren't thinking about the web, we're still totally horse-drawn wagons. So you'd want to be as close to resources as possible. But when we got into the 1920s and 1930s, I would say the philosophy of planning was more of a rational top-down approach. Now, some would argue that the 1980s and the 2000s, where we started getting into new urbanism, thinking about mixed-use housing, and folks moving back from the suburbs into downtown, there's some questions about whether that was that these technologies would support that type of growth. So we go to the smart city, and the smart city then says, here's this technology that we can use to build better buildings, to have safer buildings when there's different catastrophes. And all of those different types of models really led Dr. Carlos Moreno to unveil this concept of the 15-minute city. Fortunately, over the last 2 years, I've had the opportunity to work with Carlos Moreno at the Sorbonne University, where I also had to learn, why is this concept seemingly so new and so exciting? I think part of it certainly has to do with the fact that in 2020, and Mayor Anne Hidalgo had the whole city to redesign because of COVID. They took this particular model, which states that proximity, diversity, density, ubiquity are the primary ways in which you can develop and want to develop your neighborhood. As you can see in the photograph here, the idea of working, sharing, stocking, enjoying outdoors, health, being able to stay active should be within a 15-minute walk or bike ride. Again, some of the criticism is, well, that may not take into consideration folks who are needs assistance, or a mom with a wheelchair. So the concept is great. The opportunity, I think we'll hear some more wonderful stories in our next speakers, but the idea of making sure that access to resources are supposed to be to anyone who wants to live in a particular neighborhood. But that's where we come to New Orleans. It's been 20 years since Hurricane Katrina, and there are still areas that are still suffering and still need to have resources reinvested into their community. This neighborhood is bounded by, for those who know New Orleans, South Claiborne Avenue, Toledano, and Martin Luther King Boulevard. Why I found this neighborhood so interesting is I did a lot of work in Boston. And similar to Hoffman Triangle, you can stand in the neighborhood and see the downtown a mile away. We won't call the G word yet gentrification, but there's a possibility because of the resources that are there. The reason why this particular case study was fascinating to me was because Dudley Triangle, similar to Boston where I work, in Hoffman Triangle, the information and the data on the ground was really important to the neighborhood organization. Started in 2008 with a property condition survey, 2011 and 2012, we did that PPGIS study. And so it was the neighborhood organization who said, Can you update the information? Can you tell us what's changed? The city planning said, we're going to start doing neighborhood planning. We'd like to get information and really have a check on our public data. So I'm just going to run through what we learned about the neighborhood. In this neighborhood, it grew 46%. Under 18 or 29%, Black 84%, white 16%. Latino Hispanic 13%. Housing units were down by 23% since 2010. Mostly renter occupied at 76%. One of the reasons I started doing the work in this neighborhood was because we were looking at blight removal. And it was exciting to see that the lots with buildings increased from 61 to 64% from 2012 to 2024. Some of those lots were actually where houses were built and also houses were renovated onto blighted lots. So it's good to see that there's some more investment. The number of overgrown lots or blighted lots dropped from 180 to 68. Why is that important? You're having less trash, you're having a better feeling in the neighborhood, and 7% of the lots were overgrown. That's a lot less. What that means as well is people are mowing the lawn. They're taking care of the neighborhood. But still, 23% of those observed lots were as empty. What the neighborhood is also looking at is trying to find different ways to have affordable housing, for example.
Everything's just been waiting for.
The majority of Hoffman tribal parcels are in good condition. This was not the case in 2011. The WHO data scale, which is something that we developed to look at the maintenance, good, well-maintained, fair, moderately maintained, or poorly maintained. We wanted to make sure that our evaluation over time was consistent. So 60% of the parcels, good condition, 21% fair condition, and 18% in poor condition. Again, I'm trying to link this to what can the city do? What do the neighborhoods want? That's where the conversation can come in, where the on-the-ground verified information from third parties is presented to the community so they can have an equal exchange and have information that's current. So we have 44% of the parcels don't have any sidewalk, or the sidewalk is in bad repair. In a moment, I'll show you the way in which we did our analysis of sidewalks. But we also, in comparison to sidewalks and public access, this is where the measurement of whether this neighborhood could eventually become a robust 15-minute city neighborhood, but also identify some of the issues that I think others will talk about in terms of it's not just the public access you need in terms of transportation. You need to be able to walk the streets and feel safe doing so. We also did a study of lights. We had done one uptown where it was really important, especially post-Katrina, but even in the last 5 years, are the lights working? So are you going to stand at a bus stop where there's no light working, or there's very little light? In this neighborhood, unfortunately, I didn't want to share it here, but you can certainly Google. There's a high level of crime, unfortunately. Drugs are rampant, but there's also a really robust community. There's people moving in there. So we've got to find a way to have more literal eyes on the street through better lighting. As part of the proximity analysis study, hopefully I'm good at time, we got the list of amenities that were supposed to be in the neighborhood from the city. And we have grocery stores, daycares, 3, gas stations, 2, restaurants, 5, public libraries, 0, drugstores, 0. The city list had a school, but as it turns out, the school had been closed for 2 years. So that's why this kind of analysis, we have to make sure that the public data matches what's on the ground. And what does that mean in terms of proximity, in terms of those parents trying to get to schools? I'm going on with the sidewalks aren't good, the lighting isn't good, the access isn't good. It creates a lot more problems, and those are the ones that we hope the city will solve. On the right-hand side, we did a heat map, and in this heat map, The red, of course, always seems to be bad, right? Though I always tell my GIS students don't use red. But the red suggests that there's more than a half mile from the lower end of Hoffman Trail from a grocery store. We did a series of heat maps just based upon the different areas within Hoffman, and we segmented it by 6 sectors to see where we see the highest level of need using these heat maps. So as part of the study, we did a pilot. It was really innovative. We conferred with Carlos Moreno, and we didn't have, of course, the supercomputers. We didn't have, a lot of resources and tools. So we really did what we did, even in 2008. We took a clipboard, we walked the streets, went down different avenues. As you can see, we had several different routes from different places in the neighborhood. And we had several different teams of students walking around and just taking pictures. What's there? How easy was it to walk? What's the distance? And not in this 90-some degree heat like this morning. But this one picture to me really exemplifies, this is South Claymore, how difficult it is to be able to cross the different streets. This is a very highly used and pretty fast driving area. So if you think about across the street here, again, an elder, anyone really trying to cross the street to go to the grocery store, we don't necessarily think that this is a neighborhood that's really going to turn quickly into that 15-minute neighborhood. But we have some hope. We've talked to the city of New Orleans, we've talked to the mayor's office, and even after the Super Bowl, there are quite a bit of money that's going to be invested in infrastructure. So we're hoping that the information that we provided and the different types of stories and maps and data will be used to actually help benefit the community. And maybe one day be labeled a true 15-minute city neighbor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was excellent. Do we have any immediate questions for Michelle? Just a burning question that cannot wait till the end, something to clarify. I certainly have a lot of questions, but that will wait till the Q&A. So we will transition now to Rumana Sarker. We may need to stop share. So Rumana, we'll just transition to you in just a second here. Hit that okay.
Can you see the screen?
Yes, we can see it, but not there it is. Okay. And John, if you wouldn't mind hitting that okay button at the top there as well. Thank you. Rumana, we are ready. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Serena, for the nice introduction at the beginning, and also Michelle set the scene already for the 15-minute city. So as you know, I am Rumana Sarker. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Public Transport Research Group, currently working at the Monash University. But today I'm going to present the research that I did during my postdoc at the University of Innsbruck. So I led the project, and I also supervised a master thesis, which was funded by Hannah and Joachim Schmidt Foundation in Germany. So it's kind of like a cross collaboration, cross-national collaboration. And yeah, so we are going to look at Innsbruck as a 15-minute city in my presentation. Is it transitioning?
There seems to be a delay, so not yet.
Okay, because...
There it is.
Okay. Yeah, so you have already seen this picture from Michelle, but I'll not go into details because you're already quite educated now after the presentation from Michelle. So it was very comprehensive. So at the core, what 15-minute city means that the city will be able to cater the need of all its residents within 15 minutes by walking or cycling. And it relies on these 6 social functions, that is education, public infrastructure, special offers, Medicare, workplace, and basic supply. So in our study, on top of that, we have also looked into the mental well-being and access to transport facilities condition. Why did we choose Innsbruck? Why it is different than other potential 15-minute city? So as you can see in that picture, Innsbruck is quite compact in nature. It's the 5th largest city in Austria and is one of the very few inner alpine urban areas in the world. But that also means that it is topologically challenging because of its mountains and terrains. But one good advantage of it is that 82% of all the trips are within 5 kilometers. And Innsbruck also promotes walking and cycling. You can see in the picture that it has both shared cycling path and also segregated cycling path, combining a total of 90-kilometer cycling path. The city also comprises 20 districts, and you can see from the spatial distribution in this map that it's it has a very diverse land use composition, from residential area to mixed use area and commercial and industrial area. So in this research, we try to understand which attributes of the 15-minute city concepts are actually existing in Innsbruck, and also how these attributes are evaluated by the residents. The main motivation to do this work was actually the moment we were conducting this study in 2021. Innsbruck master plan for cycling for 2030 was work in progress, and they didn't adhere the concept of 15-minute city. So we were exploring the potential of 15-minute city to integrate into the cycling master plan. Now the research approach. We used a survey combining a convergent mixed method, that is integrating qualitative component into a quantitative survey. And this survey was administered online and distributed to the students at the University of Innsbruck. And also we collaborate with the city of Innsbruck, and a QR code with the survey was actually sent to around 79,000 households in Innsbruck. So in the end, we collected 487 respondents, and you can see in that map, it shows the distribution of the sample that we got from each district, and we actually aim to collect samples from almost all the districts. And the sample characteristics show that we had slightly higher sample in the younger population group, because Innsbruck is also a city of students. So around 35,000 students lives there, and the population is 130,000. So you can imagine it's quite a lot. We have oversampled female sample in our survey. However, interestingly, we have 62% frequent cyclists, and almost 95% people identify themselves as frequent pedestrian. Now, moving on to the result, at the beginning, we asked people how important it is for them to reach those certain basic facilities to be within 15 minutes, either by foot, like on foot, or by bicycle. And you can see that majority of the respondents reported that it's very important that the core facilities can be accessed within 15 minutes. So there is a need to implement this concept in the city of Innsbruck. In our survey, we actually asked respondents to provide their home address as well, and then we analyzed it. We did a spatial analysis, and the picture here shows the subjective evaluation of a district in Innsbruck called Pradel. That's defined as a mixed-use area, and it's very close to the core Innsbruck city area. And from the analysis, you can see that majority of the essential amenities, such as grocery, post office, police stations, daycare, they are all situated within 10-minute walking distance. We also asked respondents to rate their walking routes or cycling route that they usually take. And respondents actually self-reported that the walking routes are mostly satisfactory. And the ratings were between 1 to 6, where 1 was highly dissatisfied and 6 was highly satisfied. And you can see that it's almost green. So people are mostly satisfied with walking. So Innsbruck has a better perceived walkability in most of the areas. However, for cycling, the respondents have a mixed satisfaction score. You can see some orange bits and yellow bits in the picture. What we also did, we have conducted a separate analysis, descriptive statistics, where we tried to see if there is any difference in the perception between frequent cyclists and occasional cyclists. So we define frequent cyclists as people who cycle almost every day, and occasional cyclists were people who cycles at least once a week. And what we found that frequent cyclists are actually less satisfied with the infrastructure, and also they perceive that 15-minute city is more important for them than the occasional cyclists. As I mentioned in the beginning, that it was a convergent mixed method approach. So we did a thematic analysis from the qualitative bits of the survey. And what we found that we asked them different categories, like their wishes to improve traffic situation in order to promote 15-minute city. What we found that people mostly want the bicycle infrastructure to be improved, as well as traffic calming measures to be implemented. So some of the comments that we found were interesting are, it's too much traffic. Innsbruck is still far too car friendly for its size. Then another one was hybrid buses that are quieter will be a good option for traffic calming with the option of opportunity charging. We asked about the proximity. That's one of the core component of 15-minute city. And we asked people to identify some positive attributes of their neighborhood where they live. And you can see proximity is the main positive attribute that people find where they live. And I can refer to one comment from the respondent that the district has a village-like character and is very close to nature, but at the same time, it's very central. Looking at the well-being aspect of the neighborhood, we can see there is a need for more green in the core city area. And also one comment I would like to mention here, one of the young respondents said that small open air or bars or cafe, in my opinion, would be good for the mental well-being because young people are offered far too little in Innsbruck. And we can also see in the diagram from 15-minute city that community experience and social inclusion is an important part of 15-minute city as well, which is also reflected here. So to conclude from this result, what we can see that Innsbruck is a medium-sized city that depicts the compact alpine urban development pattern, which is very well suited for a 15-minute city. And many respondents actually highly value the attributes of proximity. However, the core area of Innsbruck lacks green spaces, so there is a demand for it. When we are comparing the existing bicycle infrastructure, one of the core components of 15-minute city is that frequent bike cyclists are less satisfied with the traffic situation, and there is a need for improvement. Our analysis and also the self-reported concern areas also shows, here you can see, we actually mapped the concern areas that were reported from the respondents, and we actually showed it to the people who are involved with this Innsbruck cycling master plan. And they said that some of the recommendations they already took into consideration while doing this master plan. And it's already now out, and we were happy to see that some of our recommendations were incorporated into this master plan, which I think was one of the success of this study. So that's all from me. If you want to know more about 15-minute city, please do contact me. Here is my details, and would love to get your questions or feedback in the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rumana. We appreciate this presentation. Is there any immediate question for Rumana, something very particular you'd like to ask while we're transitioning to John? You could put that in the chat if you like. And at any time, you can put your questions in the chat. for our Q&A period. I don't see anything coming up immediately or any hands raised right now, so I will ask Dr. John Renne to set up his slideshow. He's doing that now. Looks like he's almost there. And if you haven't taken an opportunity to put your name and where you're from in the chat, I encourage you to do that at this point. It's a good opportunity for us to all connect with each other as well. I know there are many in our audience who have experience with these topics. So do take a moment, please, to add yourself to the chat if you haven't done so already. Okay, John, go ahead, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm presenting on a research study project that I had been working on for a while and was unfortunately defunded from US DOT recently through the Center for Equitable Transoriented Communities, which I can now say the word equity again since it was defunded. But anyway, this research was mostly completed. But I've been working on the data analysis. And so this builds upon work that I've done in the past, where in 2010, or shortly after 2010, I did a study where reviewing it helped me, and we looked at trends in station areas across the United States, pretty much for 2010. I've been able to now go back and get data from from 1970, 80, 90, 2000, 2010, and 2020 census data on all census tracts in the United States. And what I've been able to do is to kind of isolate the station areas. So there's about 88,000 census tracts across the United States, which this draws from. And there's about 4,300 train station areas that are according to the National Transit Database. And I got a little tripped up with some of the data analysis because I had forgotten that there were more than one station in many census tracts. So think about the streetcar here in New Orleans, or a subway in Manhattan, right? You're going to get multiple stations in census tracts. So now that I figured that out, I was able to correct my data and was able to get it all finished at 2 o'clock in the morning today. So that way I can present to you on data that's accurate and doesn't replicate. So for example, this right here shows the public transit commuting share by walk score category. So the walk score is the walk score for the point of the train station. And we drew a half-mile radius around every train station, but the data comes from each census tract, okay? I also have data on the walkability of every census tract, but I specifically wanted the walk score for just the train station because I look at the walk score of the train station point as kind of like a magnet that attracts walkability to that center node point. So if you look at the stations that are what they call Walker's Paradise, which is 90 to 100, you could see how much more transit ridership is associated with those stations. Okay, this is correlation and not causation, okay? So stations that are highly walkable are highly correlated with a very large percentage of people taking public transit. It drops off precipitously, still pretty high, over almost 20% from a walk score of 70 to 89. But you can see the difference of about 18 or 19% in 2020 in orange up to over 35% for the Walker's Paradise is major. So what does that mean? Okay. Again, we're talking about correlation and not causation, but we could start to think about the fact that maybe, and I can do some other research, hopefully I will be able to do that in the next several weeks and months, is to see, is there a way to look at causation? And because I have longitudinal data, I think I actually can do that. So the question would be, is that as places that have become more walkable, have they also seen an increase in transit ridership in comparison to other places that may have not gotten more walkable? So I don't have that data yet, but what I can say is for implications for planners and policymakers is that going from very walkable to the Walker's Paradise category yields extremely important benefits potentially for transit ridership. Okay. And so then we have a lot of research and planning practice focused on walkability. But do we really get into what is the difference between being very walkable versus Walker's Paradise? That's something I have not heard discussed a lot in practice or in academia much for that matter. And so now we can see that it could make a huge difference. This combines the commute for walking, biking, and transit. And you could see that when you combine them in these Walker's Paradise locations, you get mode shares that are on par with European types of medieval walkable cities, like places I spent time in Oxford, or places like London or Innsbruck potentially, certainly the Netherlands, France. And so going from less than 30% of trips to over 50% of sustainable commute is really, really important. What's that?
It's blocking your.
Oh, I know, I don't know if I could do anything about that. That's the Zoom. There we go. Thank you. I don't think they could see that. Hopefully. Okay. Right here, we have, I can't because of the Zoom controls. I can't see what the title says on this slide. Let's see here. How do I?
It is possible to grab it from the left and drag it somewhere else, I think.
This up here.
Yeah.
How do I make that menu bar go away?
I think you can just drag it somewhere.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Okay. These are the shares of households without a vehicle in station areas by walk score. So again, very similar. Going from very walkable, going from somewhat walkable to very walkable, you see a lot more households without vehicles. But going from very walkable to Walker's Paradise, again, a much higher percentage of households without vehicles. This right here looks at the change in the share of households without vehicles by walk score. So we have seen trends over time that it's going down. I think the steeper decline of the Walker's Paradise is probably relates to gentrification, that these highly Walker's Paradise locations are also becoming increasingly desired by wealthy folks who have the ability to own a car, even if they don't need to use a car all the time. They still like having the ownership of a car so they can use it when they want to use it. You see a much flatter decline in the very walkable and the somewhat walkable locations, or almost like somewhat walkable, it's not much of a decline if you go all the way back to 1980, but that is probably more of the, I would imagine, the middle class folks, who can't just afford to own a car, in these station locations if they don't need a car. Next, we have the non-white share of people in station areas by walk score. Okay, this is kind of interesting. So this is for the year 2020, and I have the longitudinal data next. The reason I wanted to show you this is because there was an article that was published by our former colleagues from the University of New Orleans, called "Is Walk Score White Score?" Okay, well, in station areas, no. Okay, because if you look at Walker's Paradise, right, and very walkable station areas, they have the highest non-white share of people living in those locations compared to the less walkable stationary locations. So in this case, in station areas, walk score is associated with a higher diversity of non-white households. But where you see the correlation between whiteness and walk score comes in, you can see in this dip in the blue line. So in the year 2000, from 2000 to 2010, we saw a slight decline in the non-white share in the most walkable places. I think that's another sign of gentrification. It increased from 2010 to 2020, but that increase was not the same rate as the very walkable locations. So again, I think the more walkable, the more you're probably seeing gentrification, the more likely you're going to see kind of a less non-white growth in that area. With that said, again, these are still very, very diverse places in comparison to average, kind of suburban America or, most of the stations that are not walkable. This looks here at points of interest from OpenStreetMaps. Look at the amount of restaurants and cafes in Walker's Paradise compared to any of the other categories, right? So these are the places where the activity is occurring. Next, we see over here is total population. Okay, this is just population of the United States. Okay, so I want to talk about housing production in station areas across the US. This is just the total population from 1970 through 2020. This next slide shows the total number of housing units in the US from 1970 to 2020. So in the year 2020, 140 million housing units. Okay, now this is some very revealing information. This looks at the percentage of housing units that basically were added to station areas per decade. So in the 70s, we saw 1.8% growth in housing units in station areas. These are all station areas, all 4,300 station areas. There were 8% growth in the 80s, 1.4% in the 90s, 1.4% in the first decade. From 2010 to 2020, we saw 5.4% growth of housing in all station areas across the United States. That was 476,000 new housing units in all station areas across the United States. Why is this happening? We'll talk about that in a moment. This is median rent. So rents are higher, as one would expect, in walkable areas. So this, I believe, is my last slide. And so what I'm going to do is just kind of go back to this and give you, again, I'm going to be doing more research into the why question. Some of my hypotheses is that multifamily housing is more acceptable near train stations because of zoning regulations and because of less NIMBYism. And so I've seen anecdotally in places I've lived in, South Florida and places I go to regularly, like Denver, the Northeast. Been, around in recent years to what other cities I've been to, Charlotte, maybe a little bit, but you see that a little bit of Texas, multifamily apartment buildings are getting built in droves near train station areas. It's politically acceptable for mayors, city council members to approve high-density multifamily apartments right next to the train station. It's not as politically acceptable to do that in suburban areas, where you have much more single-family communities. And so, 5.4% may not seem like a lot, right? But across the whole country, 5.5% of all new housing units being built in a station area is actually quite significant. And is actually it's what it's showing, in my opinion, is that the market after the Great Recession changed fundamentally. Richard Florida wrote a book called The Great Reset. And that book talked about how the Great Recession fundamentally turned off sprawl and really reshaped the development industry, focusing in on more walkable, trans-oriented communities. And I think that Richard Florida was onto something. That book is now over a decade old, and I think he was onto something, and I think the data is starting to show that. So I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, we did have a couple of questions come in from Jessica Vargas. Jessica, if you want to, ask your questions out loud, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, I can at least point them out to John in the meantime. Do you want to just unmute and ask your questions?
Hi, sorry, I was just finishing my lunch.
Hi, Jessica.
Hi, how are you, Professor? No, it would be helpful to know how is defined. And I think you mentioned at the beginning that there's not a lot of research done on the definition of what is very walkable's paradise. But is there anywhere that we can find some kind of like rule of thumb of what describes each of those walking areas?
So
very interesting.
I can tell you from Walk Score's perspective, the answer is no, because their methodology is proprietary.
Gotcha.
So I mean, you can look up any address you want and see what it is, but they don't actually share their methodology. But I will say that I've been working on research with Steve Barassa and Louis Merlin and Martin Hosley. And we are looking at walkability, the connection between walkability, different indicators of walkability. And so we could, I do have some data that could potentially look at, say, well, walker's paradise versus very walkable, like what are the intersection densities, what are the, Walk Score is based on a lot of access to places, like points of interests. And they have a proprietary methodology that has a weighting factor based on like things like restaurants and grocery stores and all the other, cafes and things like that. But so the answer to your question is I haven't seen a lot out there about it, but it shouldn't be too difficult to figure it out in some ways.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. And then my follow-up question was in this graph that you had up here, what is in the US the percentage of the non-station area compared to the station area? Like, are we talking like 90% of the area is in the US?
Area of the United States?
Because I think you mentioned at one point that 5.4 is pretty high for, because it's showing a trend that is going on station areas.
The station areas are 5,000 train stations across, or 4,300 stations across the United States. And if you think about, there's approximately 500 acres within a half of a mile radius, right? You can multiply 500 acres times 4,300 stations and get a total number of acreage, which would be a tiny, tiny fraction of the total urbanized area of the United States. But Christopher Lineberger, who he was with George Washington University, and he used to be with the Brookings Institute and Urban Land Institute and Smart Growth America. He's written a lot about walk-ups, walkable urban places. He calls them walk-ups. And what he finds is that, and he has a different definition for walk-ups, but there's a lot of overlap between trans-oriented development and walk-ups.
Okay.
He finds that like the very tiny fraction of the United States that is classified as walkable urban places. Think, a lot of downtown locations and places like DuPont Circle, things like that. It drives, the bulk of the GDP of the United States and jobs and all sorts of stuff like that. So it's what his argument is, that a very small land area in the United States that's walkable is really driving this. And what we didn't see for many decades is, the data was not a lot of growth in housing. Most of these places were job focused. Now we're getting a lot of the housing getting built in these places.
Gotcha. Thank you. Thank you for that. That's all my questions. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, so it looks like Sajad has 2 questions. Do you see those, or would you like me to
No, I don't.
ask
Do
the
you want
person
to?
Yeah,
Want to do it
Sajad.
now? Do we have time for Kim?
Yeah, you have 2 minutes.
Oh,
at this
okay, okay,
point, if
perfect,
that's
okay. Yeah.
Sajad, do you want to unmute yourself, or I can, read your questions aloud, whatever you prefer? Okay, I'll go ahead. For the TOD study, how do you define the transit catchment area? Was it buffer based? If so, how sensitive do you think your results are to the definition of the station area? That's the first question.
The station area is defined as a half-mile radius around the station. I've been involved in research for over 20 years, looking at ped sheds and, network distances, and I've run data analyses using this data in the past that compared network distances versus like the Euclidean radius around there, and there's really no statistically significant differences between the data on the outcome side. So I just, keep it simple, just use the straight half-mile radius. And of course, the rest of the world uses 800-meter radiuses, but they're pretty close.
Thank you. And the second question is, your data goes back to 1970. If you use the TOD database to define transit catchment areas, how did you account for the age of the stations, particularly since some of them did not exist at that time?
It's correct. So, I mean, I do have when the stations were built. I didn't, it's not included in this analysis. But the thing is that they were neighborhoods, right? And so they're all stations by the year 2020. And so if you have like light rail in Denver, and you look at in that particular area, the amount of people taking public transit, they would not have had light rail in the 70s or the 80s or most of the 90s. But when the stations opened in the early 2000s, then yeah, they would have come online and you would have seen a growth in ridership. I've published a study in the Journal of the American Planning Association with Jyoti Chava looking at stationary gentrification in new stations, pretty much light rail stations that came online in the early 2000s, the 90s and early 2000s. And so I am familiar with being able to segment the data based on when stations were built. And so that's certainly something I could do. But for this particular analysis, I didn't do that.
Okay, perfect. So we'll have some more time at the end. At this point, would love to transition now to Dr. Kim Delaney. We'll get her going here in a second. Again, I encourage you to put any burning questions in the chat if you'd like to have quick answers to those. Otherwise, we will have some time at the end. So, Dr. Delaney.
Let's see. Hey guys, turning on my camera for a moment to say hi, and thanks for the opportunity to present. I'll turn it off so my slides will run appropriately. Let's see. And thank you, Serena, for the introduction. As Serena mentioned, I'm with the Treasure Coast Regional Planning Council, which is a regional council in Southeast Florida, one of 10 regional planning councils in the state, and we act as a resource for local governments and agencies to assist in whatever planning and technical matters arise. And so I was asked to cover regional and local TOD policy and talk about the idea of negotiation to accomplish a better condition. And the relationship with 15-minute cities, of course, is that transit service, especially in a state like Florida, is key to enable mobility. Just a little background coming into Florida. Florida was a difficult place to access as it really emerged in the 1880s. By the 1960s, we're a pretty suburban condition, accelerated by the Interstate Freeway Act, and post-war Sun Belt shift. And so the conditions that developed in Florida were a little difficult to get around. And so among the dangerous by design studies and the transportation congestion studies, Florida ranks at near the top of that list. So the state really got into a paradigm shift as it began to evaluate ways to become more sustainable and more economically competitive. John mentioned Richard Florida's book, and we use that a lot in the work we do with local governments and the public in helping them understand the regional trends that are underway. We as a state, interestingly, it's kind of like a dumbbell population. So we have a silver tsunami in motion where we're an older state and some communities are getting older. But at the same time, we also have, of course, the rise in millennials, Gen Z, and now Gen Alpha. And so different travel patterns suit different population cohorts, and transit becomes a more meaningful part, particularly for the upper and lower ends of the age cohorts. We know that buyers are looking for healthy lifestyles and walkable places. The #1 recreational activity in the United States is not pickleball, though that's one of the fastest growing. It's actually walking. And so we know to be healthy and competitive, a more walkable condition is advantageous. So, but the real issue that's plaguing the state of Florida in particular, and Southeast Florida, really as the hallmark, is affordability. We have one of the least affordable markets in the United States, and those prices just continue to climb. Post the COVID trends really were reflecting trends that were already in motion that were accelerated. And so the influx of buyers, all cash buyers actually in the state often, really drove housing prices to a point where it's a very precarious balance between affordability and the ability for the workforce, for example, to get to jobs. And what we know, of course, when you look at the relationship between transportation and household budgets is that the lower income cohorts, transportation is the higher percentage of that budget, and that gets worse over time. And so for us, again, to be a sustainable place and to remain competitive and establish higher quality of life, transit-oriented development has become a meaningful part of the planning paradigm, in particular in Southeast Florida. TOD hasn't been defined yet, so I'm throwing a definition up. Every transit trip really starts and stops as a pedestrian. The station typically is not your destination. And so the better a job we can do with pedestrian connectivity, as John mentioned, having a walker's paradise makes a transit service attractive not just to the transit dependent riders, but the choice riders. And that really is the best way to balance the transportation network. In Southeast and Central Florida, there's actually quite a bit of rail service that is underway and on the horizon. So this map just illustrates the relationship of a couple different passenger rail efforts. In Southeast Florida, it looks awfully busy. We have both Tri-Rail and Brightline operating, and I have some background information on each of those services, as well as Amtrak. And then those services, Brightline extends up into Central Florida and is going to go over to the West Coast in Tampa. Amtrak service runs up to Central Florida as well, and Central Florida has commuter rail today in the form of Sunrail. So the two services I'm going to focus on for this presentation are Brightline and Tri-Rail. Brightline is a premium intercity passenger service, a higher speed service that runs with stations from Miami up to Orlando, with plans to extend over to Tampa. There's some inline stations that have that exist within that market. So Miami, Aventura, Fort Lauderdale, Boca, West Palm, and then ultimately Stewart are likely to see Stewart is likely to see the station. Cocoa, Orlando, and Tampa with some other infill that may come along the way. The station I'm going to focus on for that one is West Palm Beach. And then Tri-Rail is our commuter rail service. Tri-Rail operates 19 stations in 72 miles. And I actually see there's a couple of my Tri-Rail colleagues that are on the call, which is great. And Tri-Rail runs 50 trains a day. It's carrying about 16,000 people a day now. So if you've ever traveled on I-95, about 20,000 people, 20,000 trips is one lane of traffic. So if you're on the train, you're grateful. And if you're off the train, you're grateful, because the balance that we get from a transportation standpoint is tremendous from Tri-Rail service. Tri-Rail long-term has anticipated to extend service onto what's called the FEC corridor, which is the Eastern Corridor, with additional stations between Miami and northern Palm Beach County and Jupiter. Two of those stations are the subject for today's presentation. One is in Boca Raton, which is kind of the headline win. And then Palm Beach Gardens, which is an expansion station anticipated, which is the OD happening well before the T in TOD, to kind of set the stage for that. So those three examples, I know we don't have a whole lot of time. The first one in West Palm Beach. West Palm Beach is the central city in Palm Beach County. It's the 18th largest city in Florida with about 130,000 residents. West Palm, interestingly, prior to COVID, but accelerating through COVID, has become Wall Street South. That was a marketing campaign that was envisioned by the Business Development Board. It's been very successful. It is a very successful mixed-use, full-service city that has extensive transit options and multimodal options. West Palm Beach has had a very focused TOD policy effort since the 1990s, when it adopted its first downtown master plan. It also adopted a concurrency exemption area about the same time to alleviate the pressure on relying on roadway capacity to enable development to happen. It has a successful redevelopment district in place, a downtown development authority, one of the few in Florida actually, and a mobility foundation called WPB Go. Pardon me. With respect to West Palm Beach, the station, though there are a lot of different transit options and multimodal options in the city, which are illustrated on the left-hand side, the one I was going to focus on is the Brightline station. So there's the Brightline station. This image is looking at the Brightline station on the left-hand side in the main image, looking northbound. And so if you wonder whether or not the market is interested in bringing TOD into these districts, these slides, I think, illustrate that well. So the station and the new TOD that's been developed in relationship to that station. Another example looking westbound at the station and the new TOD that's come along because that station is in its location. The trend of development around the station has been substantial. The station went under construction in 2016. You can't even see it by 2025 because it's been completely surrounded by exactly the type of TOD that would be envisioned, but for the affordability component. So higher intensity, mixed use, structured parking, active street facades. If you're looking for walkability and walk score, West Palm Beach is one of the highest in Palm Beach County and one of the highest in Southeast Florida because of the activation of the street and the mix of uses available to pedestrians, as well as other modes available to circulate the city. Next example in the city of Boca Raton. Boca is the second largest city in Palm Beach County. It's about the 30th largest in the state of Florida. Population is just over 100,000. Boca is the second highest job concentration in Palm Beach County, West Palm Beach being the lead. Boca is known for lots of different unique features. Florida Atlantic University, for example, and Lynn are both located in Boca. And Boca is also the home of IBM's campus where the PC was invented. So it has a long history of kind of tech focus, and that tech focus has been doubled down upon as the city has continued to reposition itself over time. The city also invests heavily in mobility. It has a shuttle service that circulates the city and a long history of good bike ped network planning. Pardon me. Just with respect to location, giving an example, really wanted an opportunity to call out FAU, my alma mater. And so the station is located just off Yamato Road with the icon there for Tri-Rail. The Boca campus is actually, the FAU campus is actually connected by a multi-use path called the El Rio Trail. And this location is about 27 miles south of West Palm and about 45 miles north of Miami. So that's the distancing. With respect to the Boca property, The Boca station is one of the station locations where Tri-Rail, who operates the commuter rail service, actually owns the property. It's an interesting negotiation story, I think, with the Boca station. The Tri-Rail is operated by the South Florida Regional Transportation Authority, which is charged with, among many things, finding revenue sources to offset operating costs and also better activate stations through TOD to improve the station area condition, generate built-in ridership, and create a more active streetscape. So Boca had generated some unsolicited proposals that were pitched to the agency that were luckily not approved. This set of maps and concept drawings illustrate 3 proposals that were received by the agency in 2018 at a time when TOD wasn't as popular and the appetite for higher density development was not there. And so these proposals were not approved, luckily, because what came in over time was in response to an RFP, was a proposal by a Miami-based developer who initially came in the door with a mid-rise scale building, 154 units, and about 30,000 feet of non-residential. And through the negotiation process, which is not what typically happens, the development quantities were increased, not decreased. And that was really kind of a call-out feature, I thought, with this example. Usually you come in to negotiate a project and you want 500 units and the city negotiates you down to 400 or 350 or whatever the number is that you settle at. Instead, in this instance, the numbers were negotiated up. And the project was increased in building heights and intensity. And so instead of 150 units-ish, there are 340 units, 51 of which are going to be affordable and workforce housing, and more retail, 30,000 feet of retail. This site will generate a $2 million lease for the SFRTA, kind of some glamour shots as to what that project looks like. And what's also important to call out in this location, I think, is the intensity and urban character of this scale of development in a fairly suburban condition. The city of Boca Raton has an urban downtown, but the rest of the city is really pretty suburban with about a 4 to 6 story program, typically trending more towards 4 stories. But in this location, we're at 8 stories. And so you can see the intensity of what is now approved. And it's not only approved, it landed the first ever TOD loan from DOT to add housing specifically in this location, which is a real win for the region and really a win for the whole TOD movement. So, because if this project can happen here, other projects can happen in other places, and this one really cut the path. Last example is in the city of Palm Beach Gardens. So Palm Beach Gardens is the 3rd largest employer in the county, and it is the 60th largest city, 62nd largest city, I think, in Florida, with about 63,000 people. The city has a very suburban heritage, illustrated on this slide. It's the home of PGA National and has internationally acclaimed golf tournaments. It is a very affluent community with some of the higher the higher median price points in the city of Palm Beach Gardens. And the headlines that are interesting, I thought, that I pulled, forget Palm Beach, Florida sun seekers are heading to the nearby enclave of Palm Beach Gardens, and Wall Street South executives are looking to live here, have their business in West Palm in many cases, and then look for a community like Palm Beach Gardens with the lifestyle that it offers. So this is a city that is a very successful city financially. It has a 20-year history of trying to prime the TOD pump. And so this slide illustrates some of the city's efforts. Pardon me. The market response to the city's efforts has been really overwhelming. There is a future station planned where that star is in the center of the slide. And the developer response to the city's leadership in TOD policy has been tremendous. The city went through a master planning process to illustrate how much more intensely development around the station could become. And the market has brought even more, and the city has approved it. And so the type of development program that's coming in now in what I've called the suburban to urban transition is pretty substantial. Thousands of new residential units and hundreds of thousands of square feet of new office space and retail space coming in around a future station location. So this is the OD happening well before the T, because the city was able to press the envelope between its TOD policies and its hand-to-hand combat in negotiating projects as they come in. A couple of other character images of the type of development coming in. Again, most of the city is a 1 to 2 story program with higher intensity development along its main spine. And this is the infill development coming in around it. This project has been actually heralded by US DOT, who did a case study on the Palm Beach Gardens vision and framework for a TOD future. And we use it as an instructive example because, again, it comes from such a suburban heritage to produce such an urban and transit supportive condition as a result of good planning and leadership by the city and its elected officials. So my contact information is available. I managed to land that in 14 minutes. I can't believe it. So happy to answer questions if you have them.
Fantastic. Very good. Yes, there are questions specific to you and but also to all of our panelists. So first of all, thank you. A very big thank you to all of our presenters. What a fantastic and rich and diverse set of presentations. I have a ton of questions and you do too. So let's get going there. Let's see, yeah, that kind of works. So we have Michelle and John at the front here. And then I don't know if Kim and Rumana could exactly turn your cameras on if that's possible. That way we can have everyone participating. So continue to put questions in the chat or, put your hand up electronically. Very happy to have you ask your own questions. But to kick us off, Tara Tolford has posed a question that that was kind of in my mind too, but you've said it so well. Tara, would you like to take yourself off mute?
Sure. Yeah, I had put it there in case I had to jump off first. Hi, John and Michelle. Good to see y'all. This question is kind of unfair. It's the question I was working on for CTalk. Haven't got the answers yet, though, so maybe y'all have some ideas for me. But the idea here is, it's really easy to promote a 15-minute cities approach, to promote transit-oriented development in communities that are already experiencing a lot of growth. You can just use your policy tools to direct it where you want it to go. It seems a lot harder to achieve in cities where there's not a lot of growth, there's not a lot of economic development, there's not a lot of money coming in. What can we do to still continue to promote transit-oriented communities and location efficiency in communities, like New Orleans, like lots of other cities that aren't growing rapidly, that can still work toward these goals, even if economically we don't really have the resources and the natural investment happening that makes it much easier in some other communities.
And Alana Irwin had an add-on question in case you want to fold that into your answer about specifically for food desert areas, in case you'd like to also keep that in mind.
Okay, so I'll kick it off and hi, Tara. I think my approach has been, and I think that would be useful in any city, is to make sure that there is that connection. I live PPGIS, public participation GIS. So there isn't always an audience for the data or for the research, but I think it is important that when the work is being done to talk with the city government, whether it's transportation or planning, and say, this is what we're doing. What are you doing? And it just so happens that the city of New Orleans is finally been able to hire a neighborhood planner, but to begin to look at different neighborhood plans and to fold, the work that you've done or even the conversation and make folks aware that these things are going on. And we know it's a long-term issue, not a quick solution.
Yeah, so I guess I'm thinking about we talk about the gentrification of transit-oriented walkable areas. And so in places where population may be declining, maybe to a certain degree, New Orleans population since Hurricane Katrina over the last 20 years increased, and I think it's decreased in recent years. But other cities like Detroit, they have taken a concerted approach to try to focus on specific neighborhoods and areas to make these places work from a transportation perspective and an infill perspective. So for example, I'm thinking about Ferret Street in New Orleans, which isn't necessarily a place. It's not a transit-oriented development. But it's just it's a walkable street that had a lot of infill development occur, and I think you saw a lot of spillover benefits, from an economic perspective, because housing prices and, now I think they're putting in a Trader Joe's on the corner of Ferret and Napoleon, which you would have never imagined to have occurred in New Orleans, given, the fact that chains don't like New Orleans, because the market is tough for the, the chain stores. So, Detroit, similar, I haven't been there in a few years, but, when I last went to Detroit, there's been a lot of infill investments and around their downtown, their streetcar, bike lanes, walkability. So I think that in a city that's losing population, I grew up in upstate New York. A lot of cities in upstate New York are losing population, but places that are doing the right thing in terms of, making it more walkable, making it more bike friendly, allowing for zoning flexibility so developers can come in and very easily build a mix of uses without a lot of regulatory hurdles. I think you're seeing investment flowing into those neighborhoods. And so even though maybe the overall city might be losing population, maybe those neighborhoods are still gaining some momentum perhaps. And I think that if you create wonderful places, then hopefully enough of that will turn the tide from losing population to gaining population, because it may attract employers to come and set up businesses that offer jobs that attract new people to move to those areas.
I was thinking about the fact that the lower Ninth Ward still doesn't have a fully functioning grocery store. And when I might be blaming the wrong group, whether it was the RTA or the City of New Orleans, when they had the chance to have the rail go down, I forgot the name of the street, but it didn't go all the way down to lower Ninth Ward.
Yeah.
And so part of it is those policy decisions that could be made differently. And also the type of grocers, yes, yeah, Rampart,
St. Claude, yeah.
And then the type of grocery stores, I mean, Trader Joe's would be great, not sure of the pricing structure, but the Whole Foods, the smaller Whole Foods that came, that's not going to necessarily serve the neighborhood. So yes, food deserts, there are plenty of them.
Well, the one in that Whole Foods in Mid-City is a great example, because Whole Foods did not, I don't think, wanted to go to that location because it wasn't a typical Whole Foods type of a market, and it was a food desert. But the city under Jeff Schwartz at the time, who was the executive director of Broad Street Community Connections, really pushed hard and got Whole Foods to rethink its model, and it's been very successful. And they do offer in that particular location a different set of food, at least they used to. I don't know if they do today, but I think they offer more affordable options in that location to serve the food desert needs. But yeah, food deserts are a major issue that are often correlated with blight. And so a lot of station areas over time have become blighted because they were in places where they experienced, a lot of white flight and disinvestment, from, the 1970s pretty much through the early 2000s.
So I'll just jump in with thoughts on the question, if that's okay. So
Yeah.
it's so I mean, what you've asked that's kind of like, that's the difficult question that we deal with in public policy, right? Because if you already have this fire hose on, like spreading investment everywhere, it's a lot easier to direct that to do the things that you want it to do. So I concur with the way you've set your question up. Absolutely. So the way we tend to approach it is one, a whole lot of education, because if elected officials and policymakers don't get the relationship between that level of investment and the efficiencies that you gain as a place, it's a very steep hill to climb. So education at a grassroots level, and especially the business community, is very helpful, at least in the experience that we've had. The business community is now the group pushing for transit-oriented development and investment in transportation. Who knew? I mean, that wasn't the case 10 years ago. Although the business community was the leader to get Tri-Rail established, but to get Tri-Rail really functional is a much larger game at play, right? Which is the entire transit network and the walkability of places around the system for it to be its most effective and productive. So I would suggest to you education is one. The other piece is kind of thinking entrepreneurially about that relationship. So what I've become, what I have concluded over time in the work that we've done is that every land development transaction, right, at the local government level, let's say, is a public-private partnership, right? So because you're always coming to the table with regulatory incentive and financial incentive as opportunity, right? So regulatory incentive, you approve a project, you just conferred value. So you're in a public-private relationship already. So using that with elected officials, I think, is an avenue to consider. Incentivize through policy and incentive, financial incentive, the things you want in the places you want to have it, and then shift away from fueling sprawl. Right? We don't have to help sprawl in Florida. It takes care of itself. And so redirecting those resources to make it less expensive and faster to build in an infill location has been successful in the region. It is a long game. You know, it takes a long time to educate people. It takes a long time to get your policies fixed and to find some incentives and put them in place. So those are two strategies. And the third is working with lending institutions. And that's a lot trickier. And that's kind of like a person-to-person game, right? But lending institutions are cautious in infill environments. And so getting them engaged so that they allow lending criteria to be flexed just a bit to get infill investment to happen is another strategy to consider. We've used that just in a limited way in some of our redevelopment districts. There are lots of districts, though, that do that on a regular basis. And I think those are ways to help shift an investment flow. But it's hard to get the hose turned on when the hose isn't on. So I concur with you entirely. But I just think, on that regulatory and incentive side, there's a way to pull the market to do things that it really isn't ready to do. Ultimately, we are going to have a land challenge in accommodating all the growth that comes. But getting it to happen faster than it would otherwise happen is the tricky part. So I just offer those as ideas.
I just want to add one thing to what Kim was saying. It made me think of something that, like the public policy subsidies that are inherent and baked into sprawl may be allowing the growth to be directed to those areas because they are inherently more affordable to build from many different dimensions, including, they're higher, there's more subsidies in transportation and other types of infrastructure. The barriers for zoning approvals is much faster and quicker. So developers, that want to, try to make a profit are going to go to those locations because they know that there's much easier approval process. And so what Kim mentioned about, kind of like the directing that spigot of growth, we can not only direct a spigot of growth, like in terms of, like some areas have growth and we could direct it like in South Florida right now. But the other thing is that if we change our bigger public policies at, state levels and county levels, we might be able to redirect where that growth is going. Even, like, for example, the federal IRS deduction on home ownership, right? I mean, that's a major subsidy that everyone just, is kind of like baked into our Bill of Rights almost, right? But those types of like big subsidies really, are directing where growth is going from a not a national, but like a regional or sub-regional level that, like, in Louisiana, for example, which parishes are growing and which are not growing. And if we were to change some of those state level and kind of regional level subsidies, it may direct growth into more inner city areas than just continuing about greenfield locations.
You know, if Rumana wanted to chime in on that question, otherwise I have a different question for you, but go ahead and answer that if you'd like.
Yeah, I would like to include some bits from my experience with 15-minute city. First of all, I would like to say the concept of 15-minute city is not geographically equal. So not all the cities can adopt this concept. Let's say, for example, Innsbruck is well suited for 15-minute city, but it still has its own limitation. For example, Melbourne is a 17-minute city, but the Greater Melbourne is not. So what the state government here doing is they are identifying activity centers in remote areas or regional areas for marginal communities, and they're focusing on those nodes to develop more transit-oriented development, provide job access. So it's not, as a whole, maybe the Greater Melbourne is not a 15-minute city concept, but maybe you can divide the city in several nodes based on the activity centers, and this way you can tackle this disparity. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to add to the discussion.
Would you like to follow up with, or for any of the panelists, like what kind of policy, now thinking about the 15-minute city concept, what kind of policies could support 15-minute cities? Like, what is the top one that you feel like is a low-hanging fruit, perhaps, for cities? We talked a little bit about
Here, I'll give you my top one.
please.
My top one is don't require any more parking than the lending institution requires to underwrite the project. So we have built ourselves into a trap in many suburban areas in South Florida. Southeast Florida, I think, is a poster child for this, where our local zoning codes required 2 or 3 spaces per 1,000 feet or whatever the factor was, beyond that which the lending institutions required. So we're overparked, and that parking, the oversupply of parking does lots of different things in the walkable environment, right? Not only do we not want to walk past those spaces, it's now 25,000 a space to build surface, it's 40,000 a space to build structured in this market. So those dollars could be spent much more effectively or not spent at all to bring down the cost of housing. And so that would be our number one recommendation. In fact, the SFRTA adopted a TOD policy in 2017 with 4 components to it. And one of the main components is not to require any additional parking other than what the lending institution requires. In fact, don't even require parking if you can get away with it, or disaggregate the parking from the ownership of the unit. So people can buy the amount of spaces they need, but if they don't need a space, they don't have to. So that'd be my primary recommendation from a zoning standpoint.
There's a really good example, I think the best in the country, of a light rail station that was opened in Tempe, Arizona recently, last few years. And there's a development there, a pretty significant development called cul-de-sac. And Google it. There was an big article written about it just a week or so ago, I think, in one of the major newspapers. There's also a really good Congress for New Urbanism webinar on cul-de-sac as part of their Public Square webinar series from a few years ago. And it's a car-free development in Tempe, Arizona, of all places. And if you look at the design of it, it looks as if it could have been built in Asia or Europe or somewhere where they don't build parking and cars everywhere. And so I think, I think now it's kind of like in the early stages, but people are now living there and there's businesses there and it's very vibrant. And I think that to Kim's point about parking, like, we need to let the financial institutions who are funding the development, right, make the decisions with the developers and say, listen, if you want to build a car-free community and it's successful and the mortgages are being paid and the investors are happy, why should the city council tell them that they need to have X number of parking spaces? And, you know, the thing is that there's this thing called self-selection, right? People say, well, you know, if you build a car-free community or car-free transit development, well, not everybody wants that. It's only going to people that self-select that lifestyle that are going to want to move into that community. My response to that is then that's great, right? Because people self-select things every day. They self-select which t-shirts to buy, which sneakers to buy, right? But if there's not enough demand for that product, right? Let the market build car-free housing because there's demand for the product, but the government won't allow it to be built. Sorry.
Yeah, I'd like to let Michelle have the last word, but and we'll do that in just 1 second because we are at time. Just want to direct you to the chat in which we have a link for you to give us feedback on this session, for you to get your AICP credits, and then also to register for our upcoming webinar. That's webinar 3 in our series, Building Regional Transportation Systems, June 10th. There's a link there for you to register. And back to Michelle, and thank you everyone for your attention.
I just wanted to go on to the food deserts, and living in Ithaca, New York, I did not participate in Eco Village, but I remember we did a study with the class to talk about what does this, you know, the issue of walkability in an environment that doesn't have cars. The first thing that came to mind is how long it takes to drag your groceries to your door. And think about Tempe, how hot is it going to be? But I think one of the things you said in terms of what could be a solution, the zoning and allowing food trucks or temporary kind of installations, foods, fruits, to be able to go into neighborhoods that are, you know, these food deserts. And I think that might help in terms of the government level.
Yeah.
So,
Urban agriculture and
Yes,
economic.
yes. Well, that's
yeah.
in the lower ninth ward, they have guerrilla gardens where the neighbors take over an area and begin to have their own gardens. And then what the city did was say, okay, we won't make you pay for it since you've already squatted with your fruits and vegetables. We won't make you pay market price. Pay us $1, pay us $500, and then it grew. So there's something there about just you said, you know, the public-private partnership, it exists. Let's make it work better.
Thank you so much, everyone,
Really
for
good point.
participating. Oh, sorry.
No, I like that. Let the public-private partnership work. So.
With that, thank you. We'll conclude there. I hope everyone will stay in touch and ask each other further questions and keep the conversation going. We hope to see you on June 10th.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.